A Canadian National ore train rolls south through western Pennsylvania. 3 SD40T 3-tunnel motors, 6,000 horsepower, pull 130 ore jennies loaded with taconite pellets. Each car carries 100 tons, 13,000 tons total. The rails beneath 100-pound steel, twice the weight of standard track. They don't flex under the load. The locomotives wear Canadian National grey now, but underneath, the orange and black still shows through. The reporting marks read Bull, Bessemer and Lake Erie. The route runs 139 miles. Canute to Penn Hills, Lake Erie to Pittsburgh, Minnesota iron ore to the Edgar Thomson blast furnace in Braddock. This is the same route Andrew Carnegie built in 1897. The same purpose, the same ore, the same destination. 128 years later, the train still runs. But here's what makes this train different from every freight train you've seen today. It's not just old. It's not just historic. It operates under a lease signed in 1900, a 999-year lease. Carnegie Steel leased this railroad for 999 years. When United States Steel bought Carnegie Steel in 1901, the lease transferred. When US Steel spun off the railroad into Transtar in 1988, the lease transferred. When Canadian National bought it in 2004, the lease transferred. The lease expires in the year 2899. Carnegie built a private railroad to serve his private steel mills. He designed it so competitors couldn't use it. He structured it so regulators couldn't touch it. And in 2025, it still works exactly as he intended. The ore moves, the mills run, the system persists. How does a transportation corridor built to serve one company in 1897 remain privately controlled in 2025? Why did no one build an alternative? What happens when the first company to build infrastructure gets to decide who else can use it? And what does it mean that we stopped asking? This is the story of the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, and the story of how private control, once established, compounds across centuries. Chapter 1. The Route Decision, 1888. A ship arrives at Conneaut Harbor, Ohio. Lake Erie laps against wooden pilings. The cargo holds carry something new, Mesabi Range iron ore, Minnesota ore, shipped across 3 Great Lakes, arriving at the only deepwater port between Cleveland and Erie that can reach Pittsburgh. 150 miles south, Andrew Carnegie's blast furnaces wait. The question isn't whether ore will move from Canute to Pittsburgh. The question is whose railroad will move it by 1892. All boats arrive regularly. The route matters because Pittsburgh matters, the steel capital, but there's no direct rail line from Lake to Mills. The Pittsburgh Shenango and Lake Erie Railroad runs north from Butler but stops short of completing the connection. They lack capital. Carnegie doesn't. Then the Depression hits. 1893. Banks collapse. Railroads fail. The Pittsburgh Shenango and Lake Erie reorganizes from bankruptcy on February 11th, 1893. Small lines across Pennsylvania slide into receivership. Their rails and rights of way sell for cents on the dollar. Carnegie watches. His steel company earns $40 million in 1900. He has capital when competitors have none. On April 8, 1896, he incorporates the Butler and Pittsburgh Railroad Company, his financing, his route. But here's what's curious. The Pennsylvania Railroad already serves Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, built in 1879 to escape Pennsylvania Railroad rate discrimination, already connects Pittsburgh to Youngstown. That railroad serves Jones and Laughlin Steel, Carnegie's competitor. So why doesn't the Pennsylvania Railroad build to Lake Erie? Why doesn't Jones and Laughlin finance their own ore route? Why does no one else act? Because Carnegie moves first. Because depression creates the opening. Because concentrated wealth during economic crisis means strategic acquisition. The small bankrupt railroads become his corridor. The optimal route becomes his property. And once built, a railroad route doesn't move. The geography is fixed. The alternatives, longer routes, steeper grades, extra miles cost more forever. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act to prevent railroad monopolies. Railroads must charge reasonable rates. They cannot discriminate between shippers, but the law says nothing about exclusive leases, nothing about one company controlling an entire corridor. The law regulates rates but not ownership. Carnegie will exploit that gap. The ore starts flowing in 1888. By 1896, Carnegie controls the corridor. The competitors Jones and Laughlin, Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel will use longer paths or pay Carnegie's rates. For how long? As long as the railroad exists, which raises the question when you control where infrastructure goes. How long does that control last? The answer, it turns out, is 127 years and counting. Chapter 2. The Engineering of Exclusion. April 8, 1896. Carnegie incorporates the Butler and Pittsburgh Railroad. 18 months later, on October 27, 1897, trains run from East Pittsburgh to Butler. 18 months to build 50 miles of railroad through Pennsylvania hills, including a bridge across the Allegheny River, 3,438 feet of steel-spanning water, spectacularly fast construction. The rails themselves tell the story. 100-pound steel. Each rail weighs 100 pounds per yard. Standard railroad rail in 1897 weighs 60 to 80 pounds per yard. This isn't standard. The heavy rail supports heavy loads. 13,000-ton trains, 130 cars, each carrying 100 tons, double the capacity of public railroads. But here's what the heavy rail also does. It prevents shared use. A locomotive built for 60-pound rail can't reliably pull 13,000 tons on 100-pound track. The engineering isn't just stronger, it's incompatible. Who builds this railroad? We don't know their names. 18 months of construction through river valleys and limestone hills. Crews laying track, driving spikes, building bridges. How many workers company records don't say. How many died? No documentation exists. Not in contemporary newspapers. Not in Pennsylvania Labor Commission reports. Not in company archives. Context matters here. Railroad work in the 1890s kills over 200 men per year nationally. 30,000 injured annually. In Pennsylvania's anthracite region alone, 7,300 miners die between 1876 and 1897. Construction work is among the most dangerous occupations in America. Coupling cars, riding brakes, blasting rock, building bridges over water. Men fall, men are crushed, men die. This is documented everywhere except here. The Butler and Pittsburgh Railroad completes construction in 18 months with 0 documented casualties. Either the project proceeded with unusual safety possible, but unlikely given the speed and Depression-era labor conditions, or the casualties simply weren't recorded. The only scholarly examination appears 109 years later. Charles F. Lee's dissertation. Carnival of Blood, African American Workers and the Building of the Pittsburgh, Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, 1897 to 1912. The title suggests the documentation exists somewhere, but for 18 months of construction during Depression labor surplus, the official record is silent. 3.5 years before construction begins, Carnegie's Homestead steel plant erupts. July 1892, the Homestead strike. Workers resist wage cuts. Carnegie's partner Henry Clay Frick calls in Pinkerton detectives. The Pinkertons arrive by barge. Strikers shoot. Pinkertons shoot back. 10 men die. Pennsylvania militia occupies the plant. The Union breaks. Carnegie's labor strategy becomes clear: suppress resistance, minimize documentation, maintain control. By 1897, when railroad construction begins, those lessons apply. The bridge across the Allegheny becomes the line's signature structure. 3,438 feet of steel, the longest span in western Pennsylvania. Trains cross it for 21 years. Then, in 1918, during the First World War, the bridge is replaced. The new span runs 2,327 feet, built higher to accommodate river traffic. Wartime or transport drives the investment. The government needs steel. Carnegie's private railroad receives massive infrastructure investment during national emergency. The bridge still stands in 2025. Canadian national trains still cross it, 60 miles north, in Greenville, Pennsylvania. The railroad builds maintenance infrastructure. The Greenville shops, locomotive repair, car maintenance. Heavy overhaul capability. Construction begins in 1893. Expansions continue through 1951. The shops create dependency. Only the Bessemer and Lake Erie has the specialized equipment to maintain Bessemer and Lake Erie locomotives. The 100-pound rail needs custom cars. The custom cars need custom maintenance. The custom maintenance requires custom facilities. The system becomes self-reinforcing. The engineering is remarkable. Fast construction, heavy capacity, specialized infrastructure. It works exactly as designed. But the design itself is the mechanism of control. Technical specifications become access barriers. Efficiency and exclusion prove entirely compatible. Who built Carnegie's railroad? We don't know. Why don't we know? Because knowing wasn't required. The system celebrates the engineering while erasing the engineers. The achievement persists. The cost disappears. Chapter 3. The Legal Architecture of Permanence. 1900, as the railroad is complete. Now comes the question of ownership. Carnegie's company builds the line. Carnegie's company will operate it. But for how long? The answer 999 years. Not 99. 999. Carnegie Steel signs a lease with the newly renamed Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad on terms lasting until the year 2899. The railroad remains nominally independent, classified as a common carrier under Interstate Commerce Commission jurisdiction. Common carriers must serve all shippers at published rates, cannot discriminate, cannot refuse service. But the 999-year exclusive lease means Carnegie Steel controls every train, every schedule, every ton of capacity. The railroad is legally public, practically private. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 intended to prevent exactly this. Railroads had monopolized transportation, charged discriminatory rates, crushed competitors. Congress mandated published rates, reasonable charges, equal access. But the law regulates rates, not ownership. It prohibits discrimination in service, not exclusive long-term contracts. Carnegie's lawyers find the gap. A common carrier with a 999-year lease to a single shipper satisfies the letter of the law while violating its spirit entirely. 1 year later, in 1901, J.P. Morgan buys Carnegie Steel for $480 million. The transaction creates United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in American history. The lease transfers. U.S. Steel now controls the railroad for 998 more years, but the railroad is only one piece. U.S. Steel owns the Duluth-Misabe and Iron Range Railroad, which moves ore from Minnesota mines to Lake Superior docks. U.S. Steel owns the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, which operates the Great Lakes fleet carrying ore from Duluth to Conneaut. U.S. Steel owns the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, which hauls ore from Conneaut to Pittsburgh. U.S. Steel owns the Union Railroad, which switches cars between the Bessemer and Lake Erie and the steel mills, Minnesota to Pittsburgh, mine to blast furnace, every segment under single corporate control. Competitors must use other routes or negotiate access at every transfer point. U.S. Steel moves or seamlessly. The system works exactly as integrated logistics should. The efficiency is real. The exclusion is total. The Interstate Commerce Commission requires the Bessemer and Lake Erie to publish rates and join rate-setting conferences with other railroads. The railroad complies. It joins the Coal, Coke, and Iron Ore Committee, an ICC-approved rate bureau where competing railroads collectively set freight charges. The published rates appear in public filings. The ICC reviews them. Everything looks legal. But U.S. Steel doesn't pay the published rates. It pays internal transfer prices calculated by corporate accounting. The published rates satisfy regulators. The actual prices remain proprietary. The ICC sees compliance. U.S. Steel sees advantage. The system is legal because the law doesn't require disclosure of internal corporate pricing. By 1925, the railroad operates 228 route miles on 631 miles of track. Traffic composition 47% iron ore, 29% coal, 24% general freight. Northbound trains carry coal to Lake Erie for shipping. Southbound trains carry ore to Pittsburgh for steelmaking. The railroad handles more tonnage per mile than any other line in the United States. The traffic is immense. The route is exclusive. Competitors watch the trains pass. In 1929, the railroad orders new locomotives, the H1 class, Texas type. 210-4 wheel arrangement, 10 driving wheels for traction, 4 trailing wheels supporting the firebox. These are the most powerful non-articulated steam locomotives in America, built specifically to haul 13,000-ton ore trains up Pennsylvania grades. The fleet operates through 1944. In 1953, the railroad completes dieselization. In 1950, it adopts orange and black livery, distinctive colors for a distinctive system. The paint scheme persists. In 2025, Canadian National still applies orange and black to Bessemer and Lake Erie equipment. The lease signed in 1900 governs operations 125 years later. The legal structure designed by Carnegie's attorneys in the Gilded Age still functions in the digital era. This isn't historical accident. This is legal architecture, and architecture, once built, is hard to demolish. Chapter 4. The Forced Reckoning. 1958. Technology changes. Iron ore traditionally ships in bulk form, almost mud-like, loaded into vessel holds. At the dock, massive Hewlett unloaders, crane mechanisms developed specifically for ore handling, lift the material from ship to railroad car. The Hewletts stand at railroad-owned docks, Conneaut, Ashtabula, Cleveland. The railroads own the cranes. They own the docks. They control transfer from water to land. Then pelletization arrives, ore processed into small dense pellets that flow like grain. Self-unloading vessels carry the pellets in holds equipped with conveyor belts. The ships unload themselves at any dock with a receiving hopper. No Hewlett cranes required. No railroad-owned infrastructure needed. All can land at a private dock, load into trucks, bypass the railroad entirely. For the Bessemer and Lake Erie, this is an existential threat. For 60 years, efficiency justified exclusion. The railroad moved or faster, cheaper, more reliably than alternatives. But self-unloading vessels plus trucking offers a genuine alternative. The monopoly faces technological disruption. The response is conspiracy. Through the Coal, Coke and Iron Ore Committee, the same ICC-approved rate bureau used since 1900, the Lake Erie Railroad's coordinate. They agree refuse self-unloading vessels at railroad docks, refuse to lease dock facilities to independent operators, maintain identical rates, block alternative methods. The coordination is systematic. The conspiracy runs from the mid-1950s through 1980, 25 years. The victims are specific: Jones and Laughlin Steel, the Pittsburgh producer that never got access to the efficient ore route, Republic Steel, National Steel, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel, all paying higher transport costs because the railroads block alternatives, Wills Trucking, Consolidated Dock and Storage, Toledo World Terminal. Companies that could offer competing services if given dock access. They're systematically excluded. In the mid-1980s, they sue 10 steel companies, 3 dock operators, 3 trucking firms, federal antitrust litigation. The cases consolidate in United States District Court, Eastern District of Pennsylvania, MDL number 587. The Bessemer and Lake Erie is the sole remaining defendant by trial. The others settle. The trial bifurcates. Liability first, then damages. The liability jury hears evidence of the 25-year conspiracy, the rate bureau coordination, the refusal of dock access, the collective blocking of self-unloading vessels. On June 19, 1989, the jury reaches a verdict: liable. The Bessemer and Lake Erie conspired to eliminate competition and monopolize the transportation and handling of iron ore. The jury makes an additional finding: fraudulent concealment. The conspiracy wasn't passive, it was actively hidden. False statements, coordinated deception. The railroads knew what they were doing was illegal and worked to hide it. Damages are calculated. Under federal antitrust law, damages treble. Under Ohio Valentine Act, damages double. The total $638.5 million. The railroad also faces criminal charges. Sherman Act Section 1, unlawful restraint of trade. The Bessemer and Lake Erie pleads nolo contendere, admits wrongdoing sufficient to avoid trial, doesn't contest the facts. Criminal antitrust pleas are rare. The severity is clear. Who pays U.S. Steel, now called USX Corporation, writes checks totaling roughly $600 million. The railroad settles with some plaintiffs during appeals, pays other judgments after appeals fail, settles remaining claims. The money flows. But here's what doesn't happen: transformation. The verdict proves the system illegal. The conspiracy cost competitors hundreds of millions. The jury finds fraudulent concealment, and in 1988, 1 year before the verdict, U.S. Steel spins off the Bessemer and Lake Erie into Transtar Incorporated, a separate transportation holding company. The assets transfer to the new entity. The liability stays with the old one. June 19, 1989. The jury declares the system illegitimate. This is the obsolescence moment, the point where private control, proven illegal, should end, should force public access, should transform the structure. $600 million changes hands. The railroad keeps running. The ore keeps moving. The 999-year lease remains in effect. Ownership will change hands twice more in the next 15 years. the monopoly survives its own conviction. Chapter 5. The Permanence of Privilege, 1988. 1 year before the verdict, US Steel spins off the Bessemer and Lake Erie into Transtar Incorporated, a separate company. Transportation Holding Company, the railroad becomes independent just as litigation reaches trial. When the jury finds liability in '89, the defendant is technically no longer US Steel property. USX pays the damages. Transtar keeps the railroad. 13 years later, in 2001, Great Lakes Transportation LLC buys Transtar's rail assets. Another ownership change. 2 years after that, Canadian National Railway announces acquisition, $380 million. On May 10, 2004, the deal closes. Surface Transportation Board approval granted. No public interest intervention documented. A Canadian railroad now owns the strategic corridor from Lake Erie to Pittsburgh. No congressional hearings. No national security review. No state proposals for public ownership. The system functions. The ore moves. Approval granted. In 2025, the railroad operates as Canadian National Bessemer Subdivision. The locomotives were CN grey with orange and black accents. The reporting mark still read Bull. The route still runs 139 miles. Connote to Penn Hills. The ore still originates in Minnesota, ships across 3 Great Lakes, lands at Connote, rolls south to the Edgar Thomson blast furnace in Braddock, Carnegie's Mill, still operating, still consuming Minnesota ore. 128 years after Carnegie built the route, the infrastructure persists. The 1918 Allegheny River Bridge carries trains. The KO Line viaduct built 1901-02 remains in service. Greenville Shop still maintains locomotives. In 2025, Canadian National invests in major bridge replacement on Route 6N in Springfield Township, Erie County, new infrastructure investment in a 128-year-old corridor. The Greenville Shops receive heritage designation. Historic American Engineering Record PA 642, Library of Congress. The significant statement reads, "This shop complex reflects the industrial architectural heritage of the region. The erecting shop is one of the finer surviving industrial buildings in northwestern Pennsylvania. What celebrated engineering excellence, architectural significance, industrial heritage, what's absent exclusionary purpose, antitrust conviction, competitor foreclosure, 999-year monopoly lease. In 2024, Locomotive 643 is restored. Age of Steam, Roundhouse Museum, Heritage Rail Alliance 2025, Achievement Award. The system becomes heritage while remaining operational infrastructure. We've been waiting for obsolescence. Federal income tax, enacted 1913, didn't end private control. The Great Depression, 1929-33, didn't break it. 2 world wars didn't nationalize it. Steel industry collapse, 1982-88, didn't force public takeover. Antitrust conviction, 1989, didn't transform structure. Foreign acquisition, 2004, didn't trigger intervention. Carnegie's 1897 railroad still runs his route under his lease terms. Not because Carnegie Steel still exists. It doesn't. Not because the original purpose remains. Steel industry collapsed. Not because it's uniquely efficient. The verdict proved it monopolistic. But because infrastructure privilege, once established, survives through ownership transfer. The 999-year lease compounds. The geographic control persists. The technical monopoly continues. The question isn't when did it become obsolete. The question is why didn't it Carnegie's railroad still runs, the ore still moves, and we stopped asking.